Okay, so what we're going to do is we're now going to move into a panel session, and I'm going to invite Merrin up to chair that, and she will take it from there. Thanks, Merrin.
Oh, good idea. It's unprecedented, but we're early. All off to an early lunch today. This is an opportunity for the active discussion, the questions, the things that have been raised for you, the participants in the audience, after listening to a range of perspectives, a range of research, and a range of real-life situations, and get to unpack a little bit of that. So, as Sarah said earlier in the session, if you have media-type questions, please take advantage of this session now, just in case there is a large tidal wave of questions all coming at once. I'll be the manager. So in order for us to keep some sense of order, if you could raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We do have a roving mic. Deborah up the back there is our roving mic runner. And if you could indicate to me that you'd like to ask the next question, the questions will come through me. Please introduce yourself. We'd like to know who you are. And if there is some kind of debate as to who the best person to answer the question is, that we'll deliberate with the panel, who are a long way away from me. I'm sorry, we'll have to have our secret codes working really well today. So just in terms of getting us started this morning, to the panel, after listening to each other's presentations this morning, are there any little snippets that you'd like to contribute that you haven't contributed in your presentations this morning? Any thoughts that you've had after listening to the rest of the program that you would like to feed into and provoke the participants to ask you pressing questions? No.
I should have thought of something.
Well, we have two new panel members from yesterday, so I just also want to acknowledge the fact that Jane and Jenny are doing the full program with us. They were with us yesterday in Auckland, and they were coming down to Nelson with us tomorrow. So they have had exposure to a different range of presentations than we had yesterday. But we also have Jim, nice to have you in the audience again today. Be interesting to hear from your perspective from the additional material that you've heard today, what you think, and thank you also for bringing so many of your students with you. Fantastic to have them contributing and hearing this information. All right, questions from the audience. We've got two roving mics. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you. I'm Mary Major. I'm from the Press Council. Sorry, I don't know if that was me. My question is probably to Jenny, given that she's from the Ministry of Health, because it's something that the Minister said. I'm very interested on where he got a statistic that the media are responsible for 5% of suicides in New Zealand. He said that 20%, up to 20 people a year. Can you tell me where he got that, please?
I think.
Yeah, just talk right into the top of the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mary Major from the Press Council. My question is to Jenny, because she's from the Ministry of Health, and it was the Minister who made the comment that he said that the media are responsible for 5% of suicides, in other words, for 20 deaths a year. And I'd like to know where the research is for that information.
I think the point the Minister was making was that the media contribution to suicide might be small in relation to some other initiatives that we do to prevent suicide, but that it still makes a significant impact. But we had a similar question yesterday, and Jane talked about it really well in terms of the research. So Jane might actually be a better person to talk to that. If that's
Sure.
all right.
I think that there are figures like that come from an aggregate look at the kind of data from the studies that I presented, but they're very broad estimates because obviously it depends on the different media exposure, depends on the different audiences, depends on the country they come from. So so the exact figure is unknown. I think it is fair to say, though, from the evidence from the studies, there is a media impact, whatever proportion of the total suicide rate that accounts for. But the exact figure, the reason the exact figure is very difficult to determine is because, unlike some other risk factor for suicide, like depression, where you can work out what they call a population attributable risk. So you can work out the proportion of suicides you could prevent if you could eliminate that risk factor. So something like depression, you can theoretically work it out because you can work out the individual relative risk of someone with depression dying by suicide compared to someone without depression. And you also know the prevalence of depression in the general population. So you can take those two bits of information together and work out a kind of a population impact. But the difficulty with the media stuff is that although exposure to a particular media item may constitute an individual risk factor, it's very difficult because you can't work out the individual level of risk, because in a lot of the studies I talked about, you don't know about the extent to which an individual was exposed to a particular media item, and you can't work out the prevalence of the exposure either, because although you've got figures like circulation rates, it's not the same as working out the prevalence of depression in the community. So I guess I'd say that those sorts of figures are indicative only. And I think Jenny's point is right, that I think the Minister was trying to indicate that although the potential impact of less good quality reporting on suicide is maybe not massive in the scheme of things. There are things like depression, which are known to be the greatest risk factor for suicide. It's definitely still worth doing something about, and it's clearly worth encouraging responsible reporting.
Yeah. Thanks, Jane. Can we just ask you to be mindful of the microphones when you're answering questions? Thank you. Just move forward. Microphone skills. Speaking right into the top of the microphone there.
Hello, kia ora.
Fantastic.
Hi, Thomas Owen, Massey University. I guess just following on from that last question, and this is to you also, Jane. Over that period you were looking at, I think 2000 to 2006, and you noticed a real increase in the good reporting or the responsible reporting. What happened to the suicide rates over that same period?
The suicide rates in Australia have come down over that period. And I think that a whole range of factors have contributed to the suicide rates coming down, and it may be that better quality reporting has helped. But we've also had, like New Zealand, we've had initially a national youth suicide prevention strategy in place, and now a national broader population suicide prevention strategy in place, which has rolled out a whole range of initiatives. For instance, a lot of stuff to do with destigmatising depression. So it's very hard to tease out the exact impact of any of those initiatives on the reduction in suicide, but I think the combined effort has been helpful.
Thank you. Over here, sir.
My name's Terry Sutton. I'm the Mortality Review Coordinator for Child and Youth Mortality at Mid Central DHB. My question comes from two perspectives. I also wear a hat as a columnist for a newspaper. So I have an interest in the media. In some of the discussion of the history, one of the instances that occurred in an international realm, the death of Kurt Cobain, was, I know at the time there was considerable media anxiety about what that may happen, the fallout effect from that. And I was interested in your comment about that. Firstly, it was in the international realm, and how do we look at those kind of events in a national context? But the other part of that a lot of the media coverage at the time that was seen emphasised particularly the nature of his death, and they de-glamorised it to a huge degree. For those who don't know, most of the newspaper reporting stated very clearly that they had to use his passport to identify him. So they were trying to de-glamorise the context. And I'm not sure, and never saw any follow-up, whether there was any follow-on effect or whether that was seen as responsible media work. Thank you.
Okay, I can answer both of those aspects of the question. So the question about reporting of international events is interesting. One of the things we've found, I've worked Warwick Blood, who I mentioned when I was talking, he's an ex-journalist. He's the Professor of Professional Communication at the University of Canberra. And where I do all the number crunchy quantitative work, he does much more qualitative work on how stories are framed. And he was interested to observe that whereas I was saying the overall quality of reporting has improved, one of the areas he observed that it had improved least was reporting international stories, and it was almost as though there's less responsibility because they're further away, I guess. So that's in response to your first question. And the Kurt Cobain case is really interesting because people did look at whether there was an increase in suicide rates, particularly by young people after that death, because he was, a really revered musician. And in fact, there was no apparent increase in suicide rates. And one of the things that was posited as a possible reason for that is some of the stuff you've been talking about, but also the fact that Courtney Love, his then wife, I think, received a lot of press. And she talked about the wastefulness of the death and really at the impact for her. So there was a lot of emphasis on the negative impact of the whole thing rather than on the fact that he was this great celebrity. So that, that was suggested as a reason for the fact that people interpreted that media coverage maybe differently to some other deaths.
Interesting question, thank you. Sir, over here.
Yeah, I'm Jeremy Rose from Radio New Zealand Media Watch. It won't come as a surprise that my question is for Paul. I was just wondering if you could expand on your feelings about the Sunday News coverage of the celebrity case on the weekend, and in particular, how, if you think that it was newsworthy, and then what if you do have concerns, what those concerns might be.
Look, I won't talk about the case too much. I don't think it's the appropriate forum for it, but it certainly is newsworthy. It's probably the Veitch case and the charges he's facing and what's happened to him this year is probably one of the biggest news stories of the year, and that's not just because I'm saying that as a journalist, but that probably is the evidence for that is just in terms of the appetite for the story in every media. It's been a big story, I think you can safely say. And so therefore the story on Saturday, which is accurate, it's actually what happened, is definitely newsworthy. And I think editors make their decisions to cover that kind of news based on their feeling for their paper and their readership. And what I thought was interesting was I think that the Herald on Sunday ran a similar story with similar prominence but didn't use the word suicide as directly. And a few other dailies picked up on the story and kept it very muted and kept away from the suicide angle. I don't know whether TV did anything. Did anyone see any TV coverage? Did they? Yeah.
Oddly, TV3's website didn't use suicide. TVNZ's website did. So it worked out.
Seems a bit random. So I think what I'd say is that one editor and one newspaper decided to go with the story very boldly and play it as a strong news story. I think other editors, other news outlets saw it as a significant story but had some nervousness around probably the privacy issues and, let's face it, the issue around reporting suicide. There is some fear out there among editors and journalists about it, and played it very safe. And I think despite that, those mixed responses, most New Zealanders have a fair idea of what happened, and probably most New Zealanders are interested in the story, even if there's a bit of a mixed response to that. It does bring to the fore the issue of the celebrity issue, and I was really interested in Jane's comments about the Kurt Cobain death. Just a question really, if that individual hadn't been through the trials he's been through this year and was still on the sports news and was still a revered broadcaster, would that be different than what's happened, where we see a a person his life has crumbled? Does that make a difference in terms of that celebrity factor? I'm not answering that question, but it's something that crossed my mind. So did that affect how some editors decide to play the story? Whereas if it had definitely been someone who is a celebrity on top of their game and suddenly try something like that, perhaps there would have been a different approach. But Jeremy, my answer would be editing is really difficult, and making those decisions are hard calls, and getting the balance right is one of the toughest things our editors face.
It's a pretty inflammatory case. I think we do have to acknowledge that there are a lot of processes in place around that specific case that we need to be very careful and respectful of at the moment because it's current. Certainly its timing for this particular seminar series is interesting because it has given us some very, very concrete examples of exactly the issues that we're talking about. So it's pretty provocative and it's pretty inflammatory, and I'm interested in your response to that, Paul. Yeah. Next question, Colin.
My name's Colin Slade, and I'm a journalist, and I'm also a survivor of a serious suicide attempt. My question is also to Paul, and it's a more general one for everybody, I guess, because as Sunny pointed out, we're all part of... Paul pointed out, journalists are people too. We're all citizens in the world. And the question is prompted somewhat by attending a mental health promotion hui a couple of weeks ago, in which people talked about social health, a worldview, and so on. And news, good news doesn't sell generally. I think you can argue with that. But what does seem to get into the media more is controversy, problems, and so on. And you could make a case that listening to the news every morning and reading the newspapers doesn't contribute a great deal to world health. So it's more general in terms of suicide reporting. But the word you said about the twin responsibilities of the media to report suicide responsibly, but also to be responsible to your readers, and what is interesting to them. And I wonder about that word interesting and where it overlaps into what is entertaining to them. And looking at that slide that you showed of the Sunday News front page, it didn't look like a newspaper to me. It looked like an entertainment vehicle. So what are your views on those conflicting issues?
Probably the first comment I'd make is that whenever I'm at a forum like this, I'll get a question along these lines around the tendency of media to be bearers of bad news. That ain't the media's fault. That's what the public like. That's what we all like. We like to read things about. We like to make sense of the dangerous things in our lives, the threats, the risks. That's how we make sense of the world. Journalism certainly drives that, but it also reflects the fact that that's what perks our interest. That's what makes us sit up and take notice. And I could talk a lot about that, but it's quite a simple thing, really, that bad news will not only sell, but it sells because people are more interested in it, and that's how human beings are. Putting that point to one side, if you do look through one of our newspapers and take the time to count the number of bad news stories with neutral news and more positive news, it's actually not 90-10. It's actually probably about 50 to 60-40. There's actually a more even split with certainly there'll be a lot of stuff about discord and controversy and conflict, but there'll also be a lot of stuff about more positive things, lifestyle features, more neutral reporting of issues. So whilst in the public's mind it's all bad news, if you actually sit down and read a paper and mark it up, which I've done, it's quite surprising. In terms of your other point about the line between prurient interest in stories and the public interest, I think in New Zealand most newspapers are pretty solid and do report important and material things that are interesting but are also important. There are some stories which are a lighter relief and some stories which are celebrity news, but the component of that is quite small. As an editor, you sit there every day trying to get that mix right, trying to mix the light and the shade, trying to mix the heavy-hitting reporting with something which will be pleasurable to read. And I think the skill of good editing is trying to get that right and not pandering to the lowest common denominator, but also not being too distant from your readers' interests. And as I said before, that's a fairly challenging role. And I started by saying that one of the reasons the media is so focused on bad news is because that's what people are focused on. And there's perhaps a cause and effect wrapped up in there. But public taste and public appetite and interest in stories is changing all the time, so it's not fixed, and what is a good mix today for one paper may not be the right mix in a year's time. So it will continue to evolve as we report stories, analyse them, get your feedback, find out what you're like. It's what you like and what you're interested in. So it's certainly a two-way process. I don't know if that answers your question, Colin.
Sort of. I think I'd like to see more debate generally about the role of the media and about community health generally. It is very hard to avoid bad news today, and depression is growing as a world disorder. So it's supposed to be the biggest. What's the word now? The biggest disorder, disease, whatever you want to call
social
it,
indicator.
within 20 years of any disease. And I wonder what role the media has in promoting avoidance of that.
I think we have a role to play along with all the other different agencies and groups and forces in our society. So we definitely have a role to play.
Thanks, Colin. Interesting question. And I'm always interested in the fact that when I hear that from a senior editor, how do we mobilise the power of the consumer? Because if people are really, if people don't agree with Paul's opinion that we have a voracious appetite for bad news, where's the market? So, I'm always interested in how media is purchased.
I'm quite sure I said voracious.
I know, that was my word. We obviously do, as a population, have an appetite for those kinds of stories. So, interesting. Colin, you might need to mobilise the consumers. David.
Yes, a question for Paul and for Jane. Are you happy with the way that the media addresses different ethnic and cultural sensitivities to reporting suicide?
When we did our original media monitoring project, we tried to look at exactly that issue. We had some Indigenous newspapers included in our sample of newspapers that we selected, and we also had obviously mainstream media outlets, and we tried to look at whether there were differences in reporting of issues related to suicide for particular groups. But in the end, it was too difficult to do. The numbers of stories were just too small. So I don't think I can really answer your question from the data we have. I don't know if Paul has a response.
My answer would be that I'm not unhappy, but that's not to say that there isn't an issue there. And I think if our reporting of any issue is to be comprehensive and robust and balanced, and if we're going to get it right, we do need to take into account those factors, and we need to be open-minded about it. And I'd be very interesting as the New Zealand research in this field develops to see whether any themes come from that. That might be very helpful.
Thanks, Paul. Some questions. Hands up down here. Down here, front.
Jill Stringer, Wairarapa. Suicides, as you've pointed out, sometimes happen in clusters. We certainly experienced that in the Wairarapa a few years ago. How do you best manage that ethically and any other way in terms of what we know about repeated exposure to information about suicide?
This is the question for me. I think any editor who came across that type of phenomenon in their community would need to step very, very carefully. They'll need to acknowledge that there'll be a lot of interest among the readers and within the community, that people will be talking about it and be very interested in it, so there'll be an appetite for information. But they'd need to just be extremely careful that they didn't create any further problems. And I think going back to the protocols and the Ministry of Health guidelines in terms of prominence, headlines, accuracy of reporting, providing context, that this isn't something that just happens. It's about mental illness, it's about depression, it's about other mental problems. And trying to keep it in perspective would be what I would be doing in that situation, and stepping very, very carefully and getting good advice. And it would be a very challenging time for that newspaper to get that right. They couldn't ignore it, I don't think. And they'd need to make sure that their factual reporting was spot on, so they weren't creating something that wasn't there, but also that neither they were ignoring something that was.
Thank you. It's interesting. We've got some postvention people in the audience, and I hope that they're listening to those kinds of things, because the issue of contagion and the word cluster is often a prompt.
Can I just suggest one other thing, that if it happens within a community, it'd be really helpful for an editor to have meetings with the local agencies and the local people, if there's a school involved, where they sit down and actually talk about it in an informed way. So possibly one way of making sure that can happen is that if there are individuals in the room who are involved in this area, and you live in a certain town, to know the editor and know the newsroom, have the relationship. And for our editors, I'd be more than happy to talk to them about being open to those discussions ahead of time. That would be really, really constructive.
That is really constructive, Paul, and certainly from the perspective of a current situation,
yeah.
We have had meetings with local editors, and there has seemed to be a very restrained approach to reporting. Now, whether that's had anything to do with contact and discussion, we don't know, but we're thrilled to see that there is not a very active interest in writing stories about that current situation, which we think is helpful at the moment.
Yeah, I think most editors, if not all, would really listen.
Thanks, Paul. Sir.
Hi, I'm Alan Sampson. I teach journalism at Massey University. Before that was a long-term journalist, and I've personally agonised many times reporting suicides, so I know what it feels like from the journalist side. I would like Paul, please, to expand on this issue of values, because I know from my own experience that most suicides do never get reported, obviously. I would like the values you gave on your list were they're much quoted values, but I don't think they really answer the question in relation to suicides. Could you please expand on what makes a suicide newsworthy? What sort of suicides should be covered?
I'm just thinking for some real examples. I think it's a really good question. I can recall when I was working in Christchurch, a local regional councillor, a prominent person in the community, who was quite a prominent businessman as well, took his life. And the way he took his life, we gave a location which made it clear what had happened. It's a well-known location for it, and we got a police warning on that over alleged breach of the Coroner's Act, which I thought was interesting. But that was one example where the community were aware that this had happened. He was a prominent person. He'd died suddenly. So that would be one example where I think you do need some type of story. And I think it needs to be a reasonably clear story so it doesn't confuse people by using the code I mentioned. I think probably another time when you look at the stories is perhaps where there is like I said about with that coroner's court hearing, where 13 or 14 were up in one day, and it's not that you do every coroner's court every week religiously and cover every case, but you might look at a situation where there is maybe a large number of cases, then you work on it in terms of a one-off which develops the issue and explains it with some human interest factor in it and some good detail, but you wouldn't do that every month. There wouldn't be an appetite for it. It would be completely inappropriate. And I suppose the value operating there is that this is a real issue. Isn't this terrible, this hidden toll? Let's talk about it responsibly and openly and try to create some awareness around what's driving these cases. Celebrities are another matter. I think they are difficult to ignore, but they are fraught with issues as the guidelines show and as the research shows. Apart from that, something which was just highly unusual, but I'm struggling to think of one of those, Alan. So that would be the rule of thumb I'd use.
Sonny, did you have something to add to that?
I just want to ask you a question of detail about the instance in Christchurch that you just described. What did you see as the value in reporting the location on that occasion?
I didn't see any value in it. I think it was more of just a lapse in the reporting, and it was almost, it's hard to, I don't want to mention what it was, but it's a location where people, it's well known, it's sort of in local law, and something had happened there, and the reporter just, it wasn't deliberate, the reporter just put in that the body was found there, and it made it clear how he died. So it wasn't that we sat there and deliberately planned that, it just was part of the reporting, and it got through the editing process. And it was almost looked quite innocent in the story, just a fact that the police had provided. So we kicked ourselves a bit afterwards. And it just, those sort of things happen as well.
Thanks for clarifying.
No, it's fine.
Hello, I'm Pip Wall from the Office of Film and Literature Classification. I just wondered if Jane and perhaps Sunny might like to comment on the copycat effects of suicide as portrayed in films and possibly fictional TV programs, although the office has no jurisdiction over those, but films in particular.
Sure. The examples of studies that I showed, only 2 of them were from fictional media, and they were both television shows. But there are other examples. Among those 100 studies that have been done, there are some that have looked at the impact of films as well. And I guess I'd say the same thing that I said earlier, which is that although the evidence for news reporting of suicide has been shown to lead to copycat effects, the evidence from the the fictional entertainment media is a bit more equivocal. So some of those studies have shown there to be an impact, and some of them haven't. I think given that the evidence is equivocal, it still makes sense to be cautious, I guess. And I think one of the reasons perhaps that the evidence isn't quite as strong in that area is it makes sense from a behaviour theory point of view that people are more likely to copy a real model than a fictional model. And the other thing I'd say is that the Hunter Institute of Mental Health that I was talking about, who have done such a good job with disseminating our media resource for news journalists, have also got a stage and screen project that they're running at the moment. So they're working quite closely with, for example, some of the writers from several of our soap operas, because some of those shows have had stories about suicide or mental illness in them. And they've worked closely with how best to present that information in this fictional storyline.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
Hi, I'm Jenny Meyer. I'm at Whitireia Polytech as a student. I'm a journalism student, and I'm also a nurse. I've worked in mental health. One of the really good things I saw, I think it was about a year ago, was on Inside New Zealand, and a comment from a teenager who talked about his friend who had committed suicide and said, "I know why they do it. It's the pressure to conform and perform." And that always stuck with me. I thought it was a really interesting comment. Some of you have talked about journalists and the effect of reporting on suicide for journalists, the vicarious trauma aspect of it. I wonder if you could perhaps respond to how we can best look after ourselves and look after the public in passing on information in a way that's healthy for everybody.
I'd like to respond to that.
Probably the single biggest thing would be for our staff to be well informed on the facts, and for them to around suicide, the understandings, the research, the protocols, and why there's this sensitivity. And really, if an editor and a newsroom are making good decisions about how to cover stories, then you're not putting people into difficult situations and leaving them there in a vulnerable position. And probably just in a more matter-of-fact way is just being careful around managing staff and being aware that it is quite difficult, particularly when dealing with issues of grief, and it's okay to talk about it and to be open. Now, I don't think we've always had that culture, so just encouraging people to say, this is really tough, I need some support. And then if you bring that attitude along with a good understanding of what the actual facts are and a good understanding of how we do things, then hopefully it does help. But I think it will always be difficult.
Thank you very much for your question, because I think that when we're talking about well-being, and we've already acknowledged this morning that journalists are people, this is a critical thing we have to model safe practice in. And this is an employment environment. If somebody was under undue stress in another employment environment that wasn't being carefully managed by their employment structure, there are legal ramifications for that and recourse for that. And so the well-being and health and sustainability of a journalist's position and an individual journalist's health are quite dependent on the structure that they work in. So the same thing applies for all of the health promotion messages that we carry and the safe employment messages that we carry. So echoing what Paul said, hopefully the environment in newsrooms is changing, that people can talk about the fact that they're being very negatively impacted by their work or traumatised, and then having the support to manage that effectively. So whether that means having some time off, whether that means special EMA or opportunities to actually address that trauma or stress directly, going on to some different stories for a while, getting some more training in a particular area, that well-being is really important. So thank you so much for bringing that up. It's a really good point. Yeah. Again, we've got the helplines, we have got all of those things that we say for other people are available for help, are there for us too. We need to use them.
Hi, I'm Sue Ingram. I'm from Radio New Zealand. I would like to hear the views of the rest of the panel to Paul's view of the hidden code and the use of the code in stories when attempted suicide is often not said. And what you think about that, please.
You guys. From what I understood Paul to be saying, you were talking about the use of the hidden code before the cause of death has been established by the coroner. Is that right? Because usually my understanding is that when a death goes before the coroner, it's up to the coroner to decide to rule on the cause of death. And because that's a kind of court, my understanding is that there shouldn't be any kind of specific reporting. It's the same with, if you hear reporting of suspected murders and so on, there's usually not a lot of detail, there are just sort of clues. So I've always seen it as in that sort of context. Now, I might be completely wrong about that. I'll be interested in what other people think, but I partly assumed that it was because of that code.
Can I just make a point on it? Wrong. The important context is that if a news outlet is going to run a story, about a suspected suicide, they should be clear on that rather than using the code. And so really, it's not so much about the code, but the decision that Radio New Zealand, for example, I think they use the code, don't they? So in a way, it's confusing for people. I think it creates more of that taboo, and people don't actually... I think most people understand it, but I'm not sure everyone does. And in a way, it's sitting on the fence. So if a news outlet feels that it's newsworthy, in a very careful and measured way, just telling people that this is believed to be a suspected self-inflicted death and it's been referred to the coroner seems to me to have the value of being direct and unambiguous.
Isn't that breaking the Coroner's Act?
Well, that's
by this. I'm sure the only editor I've
Well, I've talked with coroners about it, and I think if you read the Act, it doesn't actually say that. And I am a bit of a lone voice on this, which is why I wanted to make the point today. But I think it has the virtue of being honest, and it is really frustrating to me when I hear the beating around the bush, where people, news outlets, want to cover the suicide, the suspected suicide, but don't actually want to tell people what they're doing. It's part of, I think that creates some of the confusion around it. That's quite separate from the decision. You wouldn't put a lot of these in the paper. You'd only do it in those cases where it had those merits. So it's not something you do every day on every death.
Mm.
But yeah, it's I don't think I've managed to convince anyone else yet, to be honest. But I do believe I'm right. until a judge tells me I'm wrong.
It makes it very hard for us to teach this course of journalism school, because I think we play it safe we can't do it. But I presume you haven't been thinking.
No, and I've talked with coroners about it, and they say, no, you should do that. That's no problem.
If there was no regulation, what is the risk of safety?
So in Australia, we don't have an equivalent of your Coroner's Act. And in fact, I think you're unique in the world with your Coroner's Act. So we have our resources, like lots of other countries do. So it's a more voluntary code, I guess. And we would see stories often where the phrase no suspicious circumstances was used. I personally, I don't know whether others, there are other researchers around the globe, and not all might agree with me, but I personally think that I'd agree with Paul that it can add to confusion, and there are much more important things in terms of responsible reporting. So I wouldn't be advocating using the word suicide in a big headline or even necessarily in a small headline. And I wouldn't be advocating talking about the method of suicide, and I'd be advocating providing helpline information. I think that's much more important than whether the term gets used or not in the text, assuming, people are respectful of privacy, all those other kinds of things. So I think in the scheme of things, and as I say, others might not agree with me, but I personally think in the scheme of things, there are bigger fish to fry.
What if you get it wrong?
Oh, well, I'm not saying
did fall off the bridge.
Yeah, no, sorry. I'm saying where it's a known suicide, but where it is a known suicide, in Australia at least, the term no suspicious circumstances might still be used, or oblique sort of references.
The problem is, though, that it's...
Oh, look, we've got rebel in person.
Sorry. The problem is that it can't legally be known until the coroner's determined the cause of death, which might, of course, actually be wrong.
I was interpreting the question, though, as more about the oblique terminology that gets used, rather than whether it's a known fact or not. I think that's how you intended the question,
Yes,
isn't it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you'd feel the suspected would come in.
Absolutely. Do your reporting properly. Have the right sources. Make sure you get it right.
Of course, alleged doesn't help you in defamation, so I'm just not sure the suspected.
Well, I don't think there's a legal issue, and
do you know
I've read that Act many times.
Who would you be prosecuted by?
That you'd be prosecuted by the police at the instruction of the coroner.
Thank you. Any further questions? Sorry? Hi.
Hello, here to Paul. I'm from the Pacific, and I come from a service of a Pacific Community Mental Health Service. I also announce a radio announcer, Access Radio and UFM. My question to you is, one, what does my right as a person to confidential and relate to incident happened in my family. How does that work? Do you say no to the story, or you write a story anyway if I don't agree? The second one is, how do you know you're writing a true story? I pick up what the gentleman said, because there was a story 8 years ago. There was a reporter who came to the family and they told him the story. What happened when we read it on a paper, it was not what the family was telling them. How do you know what you write about me is right? Also, third one is, do you people acknowledge those people you write story on, or come back to say, is this story right? Are you happy with what we wrote on the paper? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. It's to me, is it?
Yeah.
The question is to me. Firstly, I think the figure that was discussed today is that there are roughly 500 self-inflicted deaths a year. Is that correct? It would be really interesting to measure how many of those are reported. It would be a fraction. It may be no more than 5%, but that would be quite interesting to measure that. So the vast majority of these tragic events are never reported, and names aren't publicised, the details aren't publicised, and there are only a handful each year where other factors mean that they do end up in the media. So I'd hate anyone to leave the room thinking that I have the view that every suicide needs to be reported as a major significant story of public interest. I think that the vast majority of cases should just be left for the families and the friends to grieve, and for them to receive no publicity, and there's no public appetite about them. In terms of getting a story right, it comes down to really good reporting and being accurate, and it's unfortunate that you've had an experience where a reporter got things wrong. I'd always encourage people to complain vigorously and very quickly if there's ever a case where there are inaccuracies in a story, because we are obliged as professionals to put those things right, and we've got an obligation to do so. One good suggestion with some stories is to work with the reporter cooperatively if it's a very sensitive matter. I've always had quite an open mind for a reporter who's dealing with a family in a really difficult time to check back notes, check back facts, and make sure that in the end a journalist's key role is to get things right, and if by working with a family in that way you get the right story, it's something I'd encourage. It's not a threat to our editorial freedom. So if any of you are in any story, any situation where there's detailed and complex information you're giving to a journalist, ask them at the very least to read back their notes and talk you through their understanding of what you've said, and get them to check their facts, because in the end that's good for the journalism as well as for the subject of the story.
There was another piece of that question, can I just pick up on that, around confidentiality? Is that right? The family's right to confidentiality if they don't want the story reported. Was that right? What about that, Paul?
Well, I think, sorry, I probably wasn't as direct in my comment on that, but that's one of the reasons we don't cover every death, is because we absolutely agree that we all have private lives as well, and our private lives are really important to us. But one of the consequences of having an open society where we have freedom of expression is that sometimes there are trade-offs between privacy and confidentiality and the free flow of that information, and that is the difficult terrain that journalists operate in. And to cover things, important stories, properly will at times mean that privacy and confidentiality are impaired. So it's a really difficult balancing act.
It is, and I think something that could have been added to this particular forum is how people go about protecting their privacy. And we certainly listened to Minister Anderton's story this morning about having to take a legal angle in this particular situation to have his privacy respected. So that isn't a course that's available for everyone, and possibly those are issues that we could have a look at in terms of empowering people to protect their privacy.
Our Code of Ethics has very strong provisions around not intruding on privacy, as does the Press Council Code, which we are subject to.
Thanks, Paul. Last question, Chris.
Chris Bowden, Victoria University. I teach a media-related course for young people and have a lot of journalist students, media students in my course as well. And just two questions. One on, for the panel, any observations about the impact of new media around suicide? And we've heard a lot about newspapers and television and that. And another one, we've heard a lot about what reporters and the media can do, but wonder if there's any comments about how we can encourage maybe critical media literacy in our consumers of media.
It's a really good question, the new media question, and we've really struggled with how to look at it. And when we did our original media monitoring project, even then, the early 2000s, we knew that young people weren't going to newspapers for their news. They go to the internet. They, have all sorts of other sources. It's just much trickier to work out how to study it from a researcher's perspective, because it's so much more of a volatile medium. You can Google the term suicide, and you might come up with one set of websites one day and a completely different set the next, or individual websites will have changed. So it's very difficult to work out how to study it. I think there's a really strong recognition that it's very important, but we haven't quite come to grips with how to look at it well yet. And the media literacy question, I think that's really important too. I think that we, as I said in one of my final slides, we know quite a lot about, at least in the traditional media, the content of what gets reported, and we know a lot about the impact of that content in terms of numbers, but we don't know nearly enough about how people interpret information in the media. So we're hoping to do some of that work soon.
Might be a very quick one because
Jane
we
has
have
to
a flight
leave.
to catch.
Sorry, I have to go,
Jane.
sorry.
Thank you, Jane. We'll see you in Nelson.
Given that you said that copycat is such an important factor, where does texting and Bebo and Facebook fit into that?
She's gone.
I think, following on from what Jane was saying, which is difficult, I think that we need to work on the assumption that it does have an impact. I think in the face of the evidence we've got for the more traditional forms of media, I think making an assumption that it had no impact would be foolish. But it's, that it's challenging to come up with methods, research methods to investigate. But people are working on this. But, as Jane said, she's got a small project up and running in the next couple of months, looking at chat rooms they're looking at. I've got a project recently funded with some other people to investigate young people's perceptions of media, and young people who have very recently engaged in deliberate self-harm, to talk to them about their perceptions and experiences of all forms of media, including communication media, news media, and non-fictional portrayal. So, there's work starting, but as with all research, really, when you start your research program, it's a bit more rough and ready, and then you refine the methods as you get data in and you discover other, better ways of getting the information you're really looking for. But cause and effect is going to be difficult to establish, partly because these media are so volatile. Understanding the nature of your exposure is critical, and your exposure isn't any one thing with these, even less than it is with print media. I don't know if that's helpful, but...
Thank you. It is a whole new animal, and it's a dynamic one. We had contributions yesterday from NetSafe, who are a national organisation that look at internet safety, and recently there have been some moves towards internet service providers to look at what kind of collaborations we can start working on in this country to really make some appeals to all of the people who are connected with that information provision to see what can be done to start to have a look at the componentry that contributes to information that comes over the internet that could be seen as really unsafe and problematic. So there are some things in place that are happening, and there are certainly no simple solutions from a research perspective or from an intervention perspective. But people are talking to each other, and we think that that's really constructive. And I think that as part of our forum today, there's been some willingness presented to have a look at these factors together, and from the perspective of SPINS, that's a successful outcome for us. So I want to wrap the proceedings up today. I want to thank you all for your active participation. I want to remind you about self-care. None of us are immune to things that impact on us. So take care of each other when you leave today, or if you need to give yourself a treat or a reminder about what it takes to be well, do that too, please. I'd like to thank very much our two special guests today, Paul Thompson and Sonny Collins, for their contributions. I think it's just an amazing contextual and valuable perspective to have people who can present from these different angles on a subject that, well, is important to SPINS, obviously, and it's important to you because you're here. So thank you very much. Jenny, thank you for your roadshow. And travel safe. Go well.